Hello and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, How It Works, Public Housing and Housing Choice Vouchers. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. The next slide. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for questions, so please submit them throughout the presentation. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, a recording will be sent to everyone of today's webinar. This brings us for our presenter for today. Our presenter is Lynette Pearl. Lynette is the Senior Associate of Housing at Refugee Housing Solutions. Lynette, thank you for joining us for today's presentation.
Well, thank you for having me. So we're going to jump right in because I'm a respecter of times. With this particular webinar, I'm going to explain the basics of how to apply for public housing in the Housing Choice Voucher Program in the application workflow. So next slide. Next slide. So housing assistance is what the Department of Housing and Urban Development is best known for. And this is the service that most people think of when they hear the name HUD. And that is with good reason. HUD programs help hundreds of thousands of individuals and their families achieve safe and secure housing each year. In fact, HUD estimates that 1.2 million households are living in public housing or receiving some type of subsidy. And that is a significant portion of the United States population. There are several housing subsidies and affordable housing programs in HUD has, with the largest being the mortgage and loan insurance through the Federal Housing Administration, the Community Development Block Grants, public housing, Home Investment Partnership Act, and the Housing Choice Voucher Program that is formerly known as Section 8. Next slide, please. So how does public housing work? Well, public housing programs, they provide direct payments to public housing agencies and the Indian housing authorities to develop and operate housing for low-income families and individuals. The Office of Public and Indian Housing administrates HUD's public housing programs. So public housing, they are properties that are owned by the governmental authorities and they're funded through HUD, but administered by a local public housing authority known as PHAs. And they're available for low-income families and individuals whose household are less than 80% of the area's median income, which is known as AMI. Now, with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, it's like public housing. It too is funded through HUD, but it's administered by a local housing authority and available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% AMI. Now, with the Housing Choice Voucher, it is the federal government's largest program that assists elderly, disabled, and low-income families in securing housing in the private market. So that's key, private market. Now, since housing assistance is provided on behalf of the family or individual, participants can find their own housing, including single-family homes, townhouses, and apartments. However, for an individual or family to lease up with a private landlord or a housing provider, that landlord and housing provider must accept the Housing Choice Voucher and meet the Housing Choice Voucher Program requirements and criteria. So with the Housing Choice Program, the subsidy is paid directly to the landlord or the housing provider by the PHA on behalf of the participating individual or family, with them responsible for paying the difference. Again, because it's affordable housing, the individual or family will pay no more than 30% of their income. Next slide. So this is kind of like a breakdown summary of public roles in public housing program. So the HUD's role is to cover the costs of the program and provide the funds to the PHA, which is the Public Housing Authority, known as housing authorities. And the PHA's role is to meet HUD requirements and to administer the program in their local community. And the tenant's role is to meet program requirements. Next slide. So let's look at the roles in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's similar. HUD's role again is to cover the costs of the program, provide the funds to the PHA, and the PHA is to meet the HUD's requirements, administer the program, and it's a little different because remember, with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it's in the private market, and now you have a private landlord that's involved. So the landlord role is to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing and to meet the program requirements. And we'll talk a little bit later about that in this webinar. And again, the tenant's role is to meet the program requirements. Next slide. So we're going to go into eligibility, and I'm going to just talk in general what HUD looks for when it comes to eligibility for both programs, for the public housing program and for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So in this section, we're going to cover the basic requirements PHAs consider when determining if an applicant or a family qualifies for public housing in the Housing Choice Program, which are family eligibility. They look at a background screening and income guidelines, student and citizen status. Again, I'm going to repeat this. These are just the minimum requirements PHAs review for eligibility. So even though PHAs, they are governed by HUD, like I stated earlier, they are independent agencies and they have some autonomy in their policies and procedures. And the reason why is because they need to address the housing needs in their community. So FYI, if you need to locate your PHA for a client, or if you're a sponsor and you're helping a refugee or newcomer to apply for public housing and Housing Choice Voucher Program, you can locate your local PHA on the HUD's website, and we're going to go into that. So Grace, can you hit that contact PHA? And these links will be provided for you. Grace, are you able to hit the link?
Yeah, just 1 second, sorry.
And I'm seeing the verifying link.
Yeah, it's kind of frozen.
Yeah, might be taking its time, or I don't know if it'll let you skip verification.
There we go.
There we go.
So, thank you, Grace. So can we stroll down a little bit? So I'm going to show you something that's interesting. I'm going to pick on myself. I currently reside in Missouri. So can you hit Missouri? Okay, here's the report. So this is how you can contact or find out who your local PHA is in your area. And it's very interesting. And it tells you what the contact information is, but stroll up a little bit. But as you can see, I'm gonna use, can you stroll up a little bit, Grace? I want to show you something. Can you stroll up a little bit, Grace? Is that the?
Can we scroll down?
Yeah, I was looking for Franklin Housing Authority. You know what? That's okay. For training purposes, I'm going to, you can stop right there. We're just, for time wise. So let's look at the Housing Authority of the City of Fulton. I want to point that out. And the reason why I want to point that out, because it says type and it says combined. So what that means is with this particular housing authority, they offer both public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So I just want to point that out. Not every housing authority have both programs. So if you want to know if they have public housing or the Housing Choice Voucher Program, you can go to the HUD's PHA site. You can locate the contact information for that housing authority. And this report will tell you which programs they offer at each housing authority. So just FYI. So I wanted to point that out. So what that means, can you scroll down a little and you can see one, because you have some housing authorities, only thing they offer is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Stop. So you see Franklin County Public Housing Agency, it says Section 8. Again, Section 8 is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. They changed the name. So with this particular housing authority, they do not offer public housing. They only offer the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So that's what that means. So we can go back to the presentation. Thank you, Grace. So we're going to go back to slide 8. So we're going to talk about eligibility. And the first thing they do, they look at family. We're on slide 8. Next slide, Grace. There we go. So family as defined by HUD, 24 CFR, it can include, but it's not limited by to the following: regards actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status, a single person who may be an elderly person, disabled person, near elderly person, or any other single person or a group of persons residing together. So such groups include, but it's not limited to, a family with or without children. So if you have a child who's temporarily away from home because of placement in foster care, they still consider a member of the family. An elderly family, a near elderly family, a disabled family, a displaced family, or the remaining member of a tenant family. So when clients apply, or client or newcomer you're helping them apply for housing, they should also find out the PHA's policy and definition, because as you can see, this is a broad definition. The PHA can determine if any other group of person does qualify as a family. I also want to point this out too. Household does different from the term family with HUD. So household is a broader term that includes additional people with PHA's permission, the housing authority's permission, who may live in the unit. So this can consist of live-in aides, foster children, and foster adults. So again, if you you want some clarity of how that PHA identify a family, contact that PHA. So next criteria they look at for eligibility. Next slide. So they do criminal background check requirements. So all adult members over the age of 18 must pass the PHA's criminal background check and screening. And the reason is to ensure that no household member is subjected to a lifetime sex offender or registration requirement. And background requirements, they will vary from public housing authority. So all adult household members must sign a criminal background consent for a form to authorize the PHA to do a background screening, and PHAs must establish additional non-discriminatory criteria for admission. So again, each PHA is going to be slightly different. So if the PHA chooses to establish additional criteria, the standards must be applied consistently and be listed in the PHA's ACOP and administrative plan. So I'm going to talk about what an ACOP and administrative plan later in the webinar. So the additional criteria and standards should outline which activities will result in a denial of assistance. So with the head of household requirements, the applicant must be at least 18 years of age at the time of application, or they can be an emancipated minor by a court of competent jurisdiction that's consistent with that state law. So that is the two criteria they look at in that area. So the next slide. And this is one of the most important, is the income eligibility. HUD does establish income limits by family size for the area in which each household housing authority is located. These income limits are used to determine the family's eligibility for the program and published annually in HUD's notice and effective on the publication date. So at the time of application and interview, eligibility interview, the family income and size cannot exceed the established income limits and household size established by HUD. So to be eligible for a program, a family must be either very low income, generally 50% AMI, or low income, generally 80% of the area's median income. So we're going to go to the income limits on HUD's website so you can see if you're trying to help a family apply for public housing or the housing choice voucher, if they actually qualify income-wise. So we're just going to go to that HUD link, HUD user. And FYI, HUD does update this every year with their income guidelines. So Grace, can you go to the HUD user link, please? Okay, the first thing you want to make sure, if you're going to try to check for income eligibility, make sure you have the correct year checked, which we do, 2022. So go ahead and click here for FY 2022. I'm going to pick on myself again. I currently live in Jackson County. I live in Missouri. And so what I'm going to try to help a client apply for public housing. And I live in Jackson County. So you got to make sure you also have the correct county as well. And we're going to pull up. So as you can see, I pulled up the income limits and guidelines for Jackson County. So that's how you can locate the income guidelines for your county through the HUD website. So we can go back to the presentation and the snapshot, and we're going to take it from there. Okay, so what we just saw in HUD's income guidelines, this is the snapshot, and the reason why I want to use a snapshot. So say if I'm working with a newcomer who wants to apply for public housing in my county. Now I'm going to go to the public housing department and see what are their eligibility requirements, and say they said for public housing, that family has to make less than 50% AMI. So this is very important that you know the AMI for each program. So as you can see with this snapshot, the 50% AMI income guideline, say I'm working with a family of 4. So based on that income guideline, they cannot make more than $48,400 per year to qualify for public housing. So let's change this scenario. So I have another family I'm working with, and they want, again, this is for training purposes, they want to apply for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And based on that public housing's criteria, they say they have to make 30% AMI. So that's totally different. I would go to the second column, and they're still a family of 4, but they say 30% AMI. As you can see, they cannot make more than $29,050 per year. So you have to make sure that you look at the criteria for the AMI and you have the right chart you're looking at to see if they qualify income-wise. And as you can see, the bottom is slightly higher, and the reason why is you're looking at 80% AMI. So just FYI, if you're checking for income requirements and eligibility, make sure you see what the AMI is required and you're looking at the right chart. So we can move on. I just want to point that out because a lot of people get confused on that. So another thing they look at for eligibility is status, student status. So students at higher education institutions who do not reside with their parents must meet additional eligibility criteria. These rules apply regardless whether the student is considered a full-time or a part-time student. So assistance should only be provided to students who are eligible for the program and meet at least one of the following criteria. And here is a list of some of the criteria they look for to see if a person meets that eligibility student status. Again, I recommend if you have any questions, you contact the local PHA regarding this eligibility status. So next slide. The next is eligibility citizen status. So at least, this is the key thing here for this particular training. So at least one individual, I'm gonna repeat that, at least one individual in the household must be either a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen to qualify for public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher programs. So you're wondering, what is a non-citizen? So based on HUD's definition, a non-citizen is a person who is neither a US citizen nor a national of the United States. So a household in which at least one member is a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen may also be eligible for prorated assistance. So this type of household, we call it, is considered a mixed household. And with that type of household, HUD does prorates the assistance based on the number of eligible family members, not the total number of people in the household. So I'm an example type of person. So for example, if you're working with a family and there's a household of 4 and only 2 are eligible for the program. So the subsidy would be reflective only on a 2-person household, not a 4-person household, because only 2 people are eligible for the program. So next slide. Next slide. Grace, next slide, please.
You can see the immigration categories, Lynette.
Oh, I can't see it on the,
Yeah, no,
I
sorry.
can't see it.
Hopefully our attendees can see them as well.
Oh, I can't see it. Okay. So as you can see, this chart shows the immigration categories and the non-citizens that are eligible for public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. This is very important for this training. And as you can see, if you're working with humanitarian parolees, refugees, and asylees, they are considered eligible non-citizens. So they can apply for public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. If you are working with a newcomer who is a victim of human trafficking, based on HUD's definition, they're eligible for public housing in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, so they can apply. Okay, next slide, which I can't see on here. So do we have frequently asked questions? There we go. So we're all on the same page. There we go. Sometimes we have a little bit of technical difficulties, but we work through it. So as you can see, this is a frequently asked question. I pulled this up. This is very important. This is coming from HUD. So can public PHAs, can public also verify citizenship with refugees or parolee members through the U.S. Immigration Service System? So this is very important. The question is, how will PHAs, how will housing authorities verify citizenship for a family with members who are refugees or parolees, and what type of documentation are PHAs allowed to accept? And this states right here, PHAs must continue, which they already do, use the Citizenship and Immigration Service Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, which is known as the SAVE system, to verify rental applicants' immigration status for any program under Section 214, which includes public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher programs. PHAs may have applicants who present unfamiliar documents. This is key. This is why I have it highlighted. When there are immigration status, consult the SAVE system to determine if documents are adequate for proof of status. So this is a safeguard that's already with the the Housing Authority, that if they get an applicant that is a newcomer or refugee, regardless, they are mandated by HUD to run them through this system. So this is a safeguard they have in place to verify that they do qualify for the program. So just FYI. So next slide, we're going to go a little bit more in detail about public housing. Next slide. To help you understand public housing and the housing choice application process a little bit better, I'm going to define and go over some common terms used for each program when a client is trying to apply. So the first thing we're going to talk about is admissions continual occupancy policy, which is called the ACOP. So to implement fair housing laws and to protect the rights of applicants and residents, PHAs are required by HUD to operate under the ACOP. And this is what the ACOP is called. So the ACOP is a written document that governs the public housing program, the policies and procedures that are used to carry out the public housing program in accordance with the federal law and regulations of HUD requirements. So the ACOP, it does cover all the operational topics such as eligibility requirements, like we talked about earlier. So if there's a question about eligibility requirements that you might have with the Housing Authority, you can go to their ACOP and see what that policy and procedure is. The tenant selection process, admissions preference, the wait list procedures, and how the rent amount is determined, transfers, occupancy guidelines, and a grievance. So we're going to talk a little bit about the wait list. So the wait list is after an individual family has applied for public housing and submitted a completed application, they're placed on a wait list. And the wait list is a formal record of applicants that applied, and it defines the applicant's name, the date and time of application, selection preferences, claim, income category, and their need for an accessible unit. So that's what a wait list is. The next common term you'll see is preference, and this is very important. PHAs, they are allowed to establish local preferences for administering their public housing program when it comes to a wait list to reflect the needs of their community. So preferences may be established by a federal, state, or local laws if a wait list does have preference. So I'm going to still go a little bit of detail about a preference. Priority placement is given to an applicant who qualifies for that preference. So for example, if you have a client that is disabled and that PHA has a preference for a person with a disability, they will get a point for having a disability as a preference. And that means they move up higher on the wait list. So that's very important that you know the PHA's wait list preference, because you want to make sure you get your client as many preferences as you can to get them move up quickly on the wait list. This is one interesting thing that came out with HUD. And one of the questions a lot of people ask, can PHAs establish a preference for refugees and newcomers or parolees? And this is HUD's response. Yes, PHAs may establish a preference for refugees and humanitarian parolees if they do not base preference on national origin, which is a protected class under the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act. PHAs may not set a preference for one specific immigration status that only applies to the refugees or humanitarian parolees from a particular country. This is a great, this is something that you should be going to your local housing authority and advocating. If the housing authority does not have this in their preference on their wait list, you can show them this is what HUD states, and they can you can advocate to get this preference put in their wait list. So this is something exciting that HUD has established. So now that we know some of the common terms that's going to be used in public housing application process, we're going to go over the workflow, how to apply for public housing, okay? So let's go to the next slide. So the first thing you need to know if you're helping a newcomer or refugee to apply for public housing is to know their preferred method of submission of applications. Well, first you need to know if they're accepting applications if it's open. So if the application process is open, you need to know their preferred method of submission. Because of some housing authorities, they require you to do it on a portal, but some still do it the old-fashioned way, especially more the rural housing authorities. They ask you to do it in person. So you need to know their preferred method of submission. Now, if you do have a housing authority that requires you to do everything like electronically or portal, and you have a newcomer or a refugee who needs to do it in person, you can request a reasonable accommodation where you can actually set an appointment to come in and actually fill out the application. So just FYI. So once you know the preferred method of submission, these are the common things that they ask for in the application process. Of course, remember it's income-based, proof of income. So if you have an award letter or pay stubs, you want to make sure you have that updated information. Now, if you have a newcomer or refugee that's getting financial assistance from a resettlement agency, make sure you have that documentation from the resettlement agency, how much money they're receiving and how long they will be supported. That is their proof of income. A photo ID of every member of the household over the age of 18, certified birth records for all members. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because I know it's slightly different from newcomers and refugees. Hospital copies will not be accepted. This is just information if you're working with a client that's not a refugee or newcomer. They do require you to have the certified birth certificate, but again, this is slightly different for newcomers and refugees. Social Security cards for all members of the household, but everyone must sign a citizen declaration of eligibility. Each eligible house member, and if it's a parent or guardian for anybody under 18, would have to sign that for anybody under the age of 18. And this is basically saying this is their eligibility status and their proof of preference. So at the time of application, if you have a refugee, a newcomer that has a preference that housing authority accepts, you would need to submit that with the application of proof of preference. So if they have a disability, a documentation from a doctor, or even if they're receiving Social Security, that verifies that they have a disability. So that's their proof of preference for that. So you need to have your proof of preference during that time period when you're submitting the application. So let's talk about non-citizens, what they're supposed to have during the application process. Their photo ID, what's an alternative documentation they can have is the I-94 card. Proof of income, like we spoke about earlier, the promissory note from the resettlement agency. And remember we talked about the SAVE system, which PHAs have to use anyway. That SAVE system will take care of that background check and the immigration status. So you don't have to worry about that because they're required to run them through the SAVE system. So again, if you have any questions regarding that, contact the local housing authority. Okay, so we talked about the basic things that they require during the application process. So once that application is submitted, again, each housing authority is slightly different. They do have an eligibility team. When I worked for my housing authority, we had an eligibility team, and their job was to review the application to make sure it was complete and also to make sure that they qualified. Now, during that process, if your client does not have a complete application, they will send documentation to you stating what is needed for that application to be complete. So that's what the eligibility review team is supposed to do, is to make sure they notify you what is needed for a complete application. If you're working with a client and you don't have a complete application, make sure that you send it in a timely manner, because if not, they will terminate that application and they will not even get processed. Also during that eligibility time, They'll determine if they can continue on to go on to the wait list. If not, they'll get a denial letter. If they get denied, this is the time to actually ask for an appeal, to ask why are they being denied and they cannot proceed with the application. So after all that is reviewed, and say you have a client, they have a complete application, they do qualify income-wise for the program, that's when they will see the application confirmation. Wait, I'm going to back that up a little bit, Grace. So we're going to stick to the application confirmation. They should receive a letter stating that they received the application and they will be placed on a wait list. Now, we can go to the next. So they're placed on the wait list. This is very important. So once your client is placed on the wait list, these are things that will happen on the wait list. They will look, if they have a preference, they'll get assigned a preference. Then also they will get assigned an actual number where they're at on the wait list. And a lot of housing authorities will give you a way to check where you're on the wait list. And this is very, very important. If you have a client that's on the wait list and if anything changes, their household or their income or their address change, they have to notify the housing authority as soon as possible of any changes. Now, all housing authorities require, if there's a change in your application, your status, you have to submit it in writing. Some housing authorities actually have a form that they have to fill out to submit that change. Because if you do not submit that change and something happens when you get pulled off, the client gets pulled off the wait list, they can be disqualified. Or if their address change and they get pulled off the wait list, they have a time period to respond and they don't respond timely, then again, guess what? Their application gets terminated and they no longer proceed in the process. So just FYI, they have to keep their contact information updated. Any household changes have to be reported to the housing authority as soon as possible. So let's go to the next one, the eligibility interview program requirements. So with this happens, say you have a client, they finally get pulled off the wait list. That is a great thing. So with that eligibility interview program requirements, what they're going to do another interview. They're going to check to see if their income still qualifies for the program. They're going to ask for update income information. And also they're going to verify the household to make sure when they apply, these are the same members that are in the household. So during the eligibility interview, they're just going over updated information. So if you have a client that gets pulled off the wait list, make sure that they work on getting their updated documentations because they do not want to hesitate if they get called for an eligibility interview. So once that happens and say that they still qualify for public housing, everything checks out, the household is still the same, then the next step is the family will be assigned a unit. That's the next, can you hit that? So during that time, that's when they will actually go over the program requirements again with the new resident, and they will sign a lease. So this is kind of the basic workflow of how public housing, the application process works. So next slide. So now we're going to talk about the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and you're going to see there's going to be a little bit of similarities into the application process, but we're going to talk about some of the terminology. Next slide. The first point, Grace. So the ACOP is the actual thing that governs the public housing. So administrative plan is like the ACOP in public housing. It governs the program and it provides policy and procedures that follow federal regulations and HUD requirements. It covers operational topics as eligibility requirements, the tenant selection process, admission preference, waitlist procedures, and how the rent amount is determined. It talks about transfers, occupancy guidelines, and grievance. So this is the counterpart to the ACOP in the public housing. It's called the Administrative Plan and the Housing Choice Voucher. I'm not going to go into too much detail again for training purposes because it's similar. Again, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it has a wait list, it's similar to public housing, and it has preference. Nothing is different. These are similar things that happens in Housing Choice Voucher. The next point. Now, this is what is slightly different from public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Remember I stated earlier, this allows clients to get housing in the private market. So they're working with private landlords and housing providers. So this is called the Housing Quality Standard Inspection. And the goal of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is to have low-income families lease up housing in the private market that is decent, safe, and sanitary. So the HQS inspection ensures that the landlord property meets the PHA and HUD's minimum housing requirements. So HQS inspections are required during the initial lease up and after a reported repair and yearly before recertification. So this is what is slightly different from the public housing. With public housing, they're required to maintain the actual asset. With a housing choice voucher, you're in a private market. This is the inspection the landlord and the housing provider have to go through in order to qualify for the housing choice voucher program. So that's what HQS inspection means. The next terminology we'll hear is request for tenancy approval. And what that is commonly known as the moving papers. This is like the actual physical voucher. So this is the voucher, and it has a packet with the documentation that a potential landlord or housing provider will have to provide to start the landlord screening process. So we'll talk about a little bit how that plays into the flow. So as stated earlier, the housing program has public housing. They have an EIV system. Can you pull that up? Next point. I'm sorry, the payment system. I apologize. The payment standard, which is PHA must establish a payment standard for each unit. And this is the PHA's way of making sure that that private landlord has reasonable fair market rates. So this is what the payment standard is. This is based on the number of bedrooms for each unit size. The PHA may establish a single payment standard for the whole FMR area of fair market rate area. So once a client has located a unit and request for a tenancy approval has been submitted, the next thing to happen is a rent reasonableness, and this is very important. Can you pull it up, Grace? So with the rent reasonableness, it determines if the rent the landlord or the housing provider is offering reflects the housing market in which it's located. This is to make sure that the landlord and housing provider is not trying to gouge when it comes to the rent that they want to offer. Best practices is for them to collect free rent reasonableness comparable to what the rent that the landlord or housing provider is offering to make sure what they're offering is considered reasonable for that area. So the next term you will see is the housing assistant payment, which is called the HAP payment. And this is the actual written contract between the PHA and the landlord or housing provider. And this form is prescribed by the HUD. HUD sanctioned this, in which the PHA agrees to make housing assistant payments directly to the landlord or the housing provider. So this is actually the legal contract between the housing authority and the landlord. Next slide. So we're going to go over the housing choice voucher application flow chart. Next slide. Again, not to be repetitive, this is similar again to public housing. The application process is the same requirements what they're asking for the packet. The eligibility review is similar to public housing. They want to make sure it's a complete application and make sure that they still qualify for the housing choice voucher program. Next, again, it's no different from public housing. The client will receive an application confirmation that they will proceed on to the wait list, or if anything is missing, how to have a complete application. Again, this is similar again to public housing, the wait list. The preference are assigned during the wait list. Again, they have to keep their information updated if anything has changed with the housing authority. Next. Again, they will receive an eligibility interview to make sure they still qualify for the program. They would have to bring in their update income information. Next. Now, this is slightly different from public housing. So once they have their eligibility interview, their voucher briefing about what the program requirements are, that's when they will receive approval, and that's when they will get the actual voucher. And with that request for tenancy approval, this is when the client will receive the amount of money that they can look for, how much, what their bedroom sizes their voucher is, and how much money they can spend to find housing. And they will also receive a packet. So once they identify housing with a private landlord or housing provider, they would give them that packet. And then that housing potential landlord housing provider would have to fill that packet and send it to the housing authority to get approved as a landlord. Now, the thing that you need to know about the request for tenancy approval in this process, most housing authorities only give families 60 days to find housing once they get the actual voucher. So once they get that voucher, we call the clock starts. So once that clock starts, the housing authority gives them those 60 days to find the housing, then actually get the landlord has to get the packet done and submitted to the housing authority, and they have to get the inspection. So it's a tight turnaround. So if you have a client that actually gets their request for tenancy approval and they actually have the voucher in hand, they need to know they cannot take their time finding a actual house, because once that 60 days is up, their voucher expires. However, if they find that they cannot get housing in those 60 days, they should go to the housing authority and ask for an extension on their voucher. A lot of families do not get an extension, and if they don't get that extension, guess what? They have to start the process over again. So it's very important that they ask for an extension if they cannot find housing or get approved within that 60-day period. So the next step, so say they get approval. Well, we already talked about that. I'm sorry, we skipped over. Well, they locate the housing. Again, they will do the rent reason. I apologize on how we skipped over. They do the rent reasonableness, and then, okay, let's back that up. They get the HQS inspection done. So all this is done within the 60-day period. So go ahead, Grace. So we talked about that. So once that house gets approved, say that the landlord gets approved through the housing authority through the inspection, they will sign that contract with the housing authority, which is the HAP payment, and then that's when the family finally leases up. So they will lease up. They will actually sign a lease with the actual private landlord. Again, the lease has to be approved by the housing authority. So I want to show you all this because all this has to happen in 60 days, and that's a lot. So it's very important if you have a family that gets a voucher that they know the process and get it done within 60 days or ask for an extension. If not, they will lose their voucher and they would have to start this whole process over again. So the next slide. So again, I know that's a lot of information. So this concludes our training for today, our webinar for today. But if you have additional questions, which a lot of people do, feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email at lpearl@cwsglobal.org, or you can go to our website and you can request technical assistance. We do provide 20-minute technical assistance, or if you need more time, you can email me. We can do 20, 40 minutes. So I'm here and available to ask questions. So any questions? I know that's a lot.
Yeah, no. And we do, it is a lot of information, but we appreciate the expertise, Lynette. And we do have, a few 5 minutes here that that folks can ask questions of Lynette right here. Although, as she mentioned, you can also follow up with her or with Refugee Housing Solutions for technical assistance. I do have a few questions that folks have been typing in.
Okay.
One is, let's see, what should we do if the PHA, the Public Housing Authority, says the person needs a birth certificate, but the refugee client is unable to provide their birth certificate? Do you have any suggestions?
There is a form that, again, each PHA, there is a form that they actually can fill out for verification because they are a refugee and newcomer. So there is a form they can fill out verifying the birth area. However, they can do that to get through the application process, but once they get pulled off for the interview, they should be working on already getting a copy of some type of birth certificate.
Let's see. We are working with families of 7+ people, large families. What strategies would you use for getting them access to public housing?
Now, public housing is different from the Housing Choice Voucher Program. If you have larger families, again, depending on where you live, I recommend applying for Housing Choice Voucher. And the reason why is because you can go into the private market and you can find housing that has you can rent with a landlord who's willing to accept the voucher, who has larger houses. Because again, they're going to subsidize that subsidy based on how many people in your family versus, again, if you go to public housing, depending what they have available. Now you have some public housing that has, up to 5 bedrooms to accommodate a family size. But if you get a Housing Choice Voucher program, you're more likely to lease up with a house with larger rooms and get that subsidy, because your housing choice voucher is based on how many people are in the family. So you're going to get more, you're going to have more selection when you have a housing choice voucher program. Voucher, yes.
Great. And they actually typed in that was very helpful. I have a general question that is actually not in regards to, I don't think, vouchers or public housing, but I'm going to hit it because we like to answer people's questions. But someone was asking, if you're welcoming a newcomer, who would provide the promissory note? And I believe that this is like a newcomer who hasn't come yet. So I just wanted to mention, because I think that some viewers of this webinar might be tuning in, and maybe they haven't even welcomed a family yet, right? But they're interested in housing options because they're planning on welcoming a family. So I think if it's required, this refers to a promissory note. They were asking who provides the promissory notes, even for like a private housing private housing provider, an apartment community, or a private landlord. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lynette? Or I can also share some
No,
thoughts.
but if they're working with a resettlement agency, I know before they arrive, they usually are going to be assigned a resettlement agency. So if they're working with a resettlement agency, that resettlement agency should be providing that promissory note if they're providing financial assistance.
And I think too, some folks might be joining the call. They might be working with a resettlement agency. They might be working through another program. So it's a matter of reaching out to the program that you're working with and seeing. Some are able to provide letters, like you said, maybe a promissory note, or maybe just a letter describing their assistance. Some are not able to help out in that way for various reasons. But a lot of times they'll have good advice, right? Or like landlords that already work with newcomers. So even if they can't provide a promissory note, they would probably have advice for you. And actually this person with the question, we can contact you with the information about this specific program as well. I also wanted to ask that question, as far as what are the wait lists or what have you? Are these usually options for families that have not yet arrived, or are these more options for families that may already be here?
There are options for families that are already here. However, each wait list is slightly different based on, again, the housing authority, the city. Larger cities, of course, you're going to have longer wait lists. When I used to be a housing specialist, the thing I used to do, especially when I worked in bigger cities, I would have my families, if it was possible, especially with the housing choice voucher, because it's a portable voucher, I would have them get assistance through a smaller housing authority in a rural area who did not have a large wait list. And based on the housing choice voucher, you're required to stay in that area for a year. Then once that year is up, you can take that housing choice voucher and transfer to a bigger city. That's how I had got most of my families or housing choice voucher, if they can. Now every family or client can do that. I would have them go to a rural area where there was not a list, a waiting list, have them get that housing choice voucher, and then meet that mandatory year requirement, and then lease and take it and transfer to a bigger city. Again, it's different from housing authority to housing authority, but these options are for those who are currently here.
Yeah, let's see. And we have some, volunteers and sponsors with us today that might be working, and staff that are working with families just for 3 months, right? Or 9 months or something like that. And want to know, like how they can help when sometimes this is like a multi-month process, or some of the wait lists. Could you give us an example? Some of the wait lists are quite long, correct? Like longer than 3 months or 9 months.
Yeah, but even if you get the process started, even if you get them on the wait list and say, like you said, they're only working with them for 3 months, and say 6 months down the line, they get called off the wait list. So you can at least get that process started. That could be just a plan B for them. I mean, what's the worst can happen? They are on a wait list, and they eventually, even 6-9 months from now, they can get called. I would say if their wait list is open, I would say start the process, get them on the wait list, because you never know.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful advice, although please correct me if I'm wrong, that as far as, like in your locality, if you reach out to your public housing authority and just find out what the options are locally and what the wait list times are and kind of what the different touch points are. And then, you might not be, still working with the family, but you could give them a flyer, right? Or, you know, or like after they've been here for a few months, if you do have good options in your community, you could maybe take them into your public housing authority there and say, hey, you know, like this is a place that you could check in with. You know, sometimes they might have these great programs. But I know, you know, I've worked in resettlement in several different communities, and sometimes the wait lists were quite long, and kind of by the time the family got to the wait list, and this is good news, they actually made too much money, right? Like, you know, like they had several employers and actually were making a decent income, you know, and so by the time that they'd make it through the wait list, you know, or maybe they preferred in their community a private apartment community that was better located, or where there were a lot of other people from their ethnic community. So it wasn't always the best option, but I know, man, in some communities where I lived, it was like they had a new public housing, you know, complex, or it was a family that, you know, like an elderly couple, or, you know, and when they made it through the process, and some of the places the housing was quite lovely, and quite affordable. So I think it does make sense to kind of check in your community, find out where those touch points are, and what options the family has, so that they can follow up.
Me, when I used to do housing, I was always about networking. Even when I was the director of Section 8, if I had a good relationship with a housing specialist, even though we did not house their client at the time, once our wait list opened up, I sent them an email. Even though you have to publicly, you know, notify the public when the wait list is open, but if I had that constant contact with that worker and I knew that our wait list was about to open, of course, I had to do it at the same time that we had to make it public. They still had heads up. And not just that, working with your housing authority, you have access to landlords. Even though some of these landlords are working with the housing authorities, they have other properties that they probably don't want to put in the housing choice voucher program. And they were willing to work with you, if they know that you're working with the agencies and they know that that particular tenant is going to get that support. So it doesn't even hurt just to keep in contact, because you don't know what type of landlords you can recruit from the housing authority as well.
Great. Let me see. And I believe that those are all the questions that we have for today. Thank you again, Lynette, and thank you everyone else for attending today's Lunch and Learn. We'd like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn. We'd also love any suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. If you take a moment right now to complete a survey, you can use your phone to follow the QR code that is there on your screen, or you can also follow a link that will be dropped in the chat. The link will also be included in the follow-up email that you will receive today with the recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.